It's very exciting to be in Ohio on the eve of the election. So I was asked before about my opinion. The only thing I have to say is for Purim, my family has a costume. I'm going to be Esther Clinton. My husband is going to be Mordechai Sanders. One of my daughters is going to be Haman Trump. And our other daughter is going to be Zeresh Kelly, and she's going to interview us. So that's I think, about all I have to say. And I hope I didn't offend anyone. But all right, we don't want this country to go. Let's make sure that we stay sane, even though it's Purim. Okay, so with that, I want to talk about, Alana asked me to talk a little bit about Bible study in Israel, and I was fortunate the last 2 years I've been in Israel working as a journalist and writing about some interesting things in terms of the ways the Bible is studied there. So the evening scene is on an alley called Simtat Shalush in an up-and-coming neighborhood of Tel Aviv, inside an art gallery. There's an exhibit of jewelry, modish and elaborate, made of stones and leather, precious metals and gems. A talk by a leading Israeli fashion designer, Sharon Tal, who designs for Hamaskit. A courtyard decorated with lights and hanging lanterns, an open bar, and savory Mediterranean appetizers and desserts. The black-clad, high-heeled fashion crowd listens raptly as the winners of the jewelry competition are announced. There are 10 items of jewelry, all extremely varied, and showed all manner of inspiration. One piece was a leather helmet with a cutout design inspired by the description of the mitre, the cap of the high priest. Another, bracelets were influenced by the tent of meeting made out of parchment and metal. A third design incorporated the acacia wood of the tabernacle, and the fourth was a ring whose shape had wings in homage to the wings of the cherubs on either side of the tabernacle hovering over the ring. A fifth was a ring in the shape of a miniature tabernacle with handles like those used to carry the Mishkan, the portable worship space. The variety and range of ways the artist found inspiration was intriguing to this viewer. So this is not what you think, some kind of high fashion crowd. This was a jewelry exhibition organized by a website called 929. So does anybody know what 929 symbolizes? We all know 613 or 248, 365. 929 is the number of chapters in our Tanakh. So there are 929 chapters in Tanakh, and people are probably familiar with the idea of daf yomi, of studying a page of Talmud a day. If you study a page of Talmud a day over 7 years, you can complete the entire cycle of studying the Talmud. And this happens every 7 years. There's a big event in this country at Madison Square Garden. I'm not sure where it even is in Israel, but I'm sure it's huge. So this organization decided instead of Daf Yomi, we should also have a Perek Yomi, although it's not exactly one per day, it's 5 per week. And if you study 5 per week in 3.5 years, you can complete the cycle of studying the whole Tanakh, and they plan to do it for Israel Independence Day in 2018. So this is kind of an interesting thing to be able to get people to do this. So based on the Daf Yomi, and the Daf Yomi was started by a rabbi about 100 years, a little over 100 years. I have the name. About 100 years ago, who decided that Rabbi Meir Shapiro of Sanok, Poland, in 1923 at the World Congress of Agudat Yisrael in Vienna, so a little over 100 years ago, set up the Daf Yomi system to complete all 2,711 pages of Talmud in 7.5 years. So the Tanakh system is, less. It's only 3.5 years, 5 days a week, 1 chapter a day. But the idea is that you could meet someone anywhere and be studying the same page that you'd be united with this text. So 929 is now only in Israel. They do hope to spread it around the world. I think it'll be a really interesting concept if that happens. But what's interesting about what they're doing is it's not just text study, it's cultural as well. So an important part of what they're doing is trying to get the Bible to permeate the culture. So Exodus is the perfect place to have jewelry designers involved, right? Because if you think about it, really Exodus is all about the materials and the blueprint for what needs to happen, right? From chapter 25 to chapter 40, the last 15 chapters of Exodus is completely, except for the exception of the story of the golden calf, it's completely a blueprint for design. A friend of mine called these the interior design parshiot, right? If you're interested in interior design, there's a color scheme. My daughter recently had her bat mitzvah, and it was really easy to choose the color scheme. We did red, blue, and purple because that's what's in the parsha, right? Very easy. So what 929 is trying to do is to get biblical ideas and themes to influence the culture. So one of the jewelry designers, it was very interesting, said that she felt like she really had a contribution to make with her design. She said that she chose Exodus 25 because she saw the Holy Ark as something meaningful and because it symbolizes the sacred covenant. But she felt that reading the biblical text was intriguing and interesting, particularly in the precise details it included about the materials and dimensions of the project. Her name was Adva Atias, and she wrote she was able to connect to and understand the text of Exodus and thus to express what's written in Exodus by creating contribute. She hadn't taken inspiration from a Tanakh, from a Bible in her designs before, but she could express what's written in Exodus by creating jewelry. And I think that that's a really valuable perspective, that people in all fields of endeavor have a way of relating to the text, that there's something you can do, whatever your field of endeavor is, that can add something to the text. And I was very touched and impressed by this other projects that they do. They have singers who've written songs for each of the biblical books. They're, I believe, in the book of Kings now. When I was with them, obviously they were doing Exodus. This was last year, so they've advanced a lot. But they have popular songwriters write the songs, and these songs are played on the radio. So people are learning something about the book of Exodus just from popular songs on the radio. Another thing that they've done is had artists do murals. They had an artist design a mural and have people put it up right at the central bus station in Tel Aviv. And then there's another place. Anyone who's been to Israel recently, has anyone been to the Tachana Rishona in Jerusalem? The first train station? Okay, so the first train station is this whole new cultural center. There's an outdoor space. They do Kabbalat Shabbat every week. Different groups come in and do things. I walked through on a Shabbat morning, and there were people doing Tai Chi. It was like a Tai Chi convention. And they had artists do murals relating to the Bible. So when I was there, I saw a mural of 3 girls sitting on their cell phones and looking at their cell phones. And in Hebrew, it said it's not good for man to be alone, because they're all sitting there together looking at their cell phones, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the book. Sherry Turkle, who's a scientist at MIT, wrote a book about alone together. Right, so alone together, that's exactly what, everyone today is alone together on their cell phones, but to try to get people to think, well, what does it mean it's not good for man to be alone? So they're really trying to permeate the culture in all kinds of ways that just aren't possible here. Another thing that they've done, so the prime thing of this 929 is a website, and it is all in Hebrew, so it's not accessible, but they have a chapter of the Bible every day, and they also have someone reading it in Hebrew. You can, if you don't want to spend the time and look at the website while you're driving, you can listen to someone reading the verses, and then they have people commenting on the side. So it's sort of like the design of a traditional page where the text is in the middle, or actually the text is on the side, and then they have in the middle all of the commentaries. Is the sound system okay?
Yes, I'm just going to fiddle with it for a second.
Okay. I'm okay just speaking. It's a small room, but I want people to hear me. So.
I think it's a little too loud. That's
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's not you.
I didn't realize. Okay. So they've had, so it's a website. They have animation artists create things. So there are all kinds of creative ways that this site has gotten people sort of interested in the Bible. And it's actually sort of funny. Interviewed someone who kind of helped get it started. His name is Avi Vortzman. He's a former member of Knesset. And when I asked if there was one event or one moment that inspired him to initiate this idea of having Israelis study Bible together, he cited an episode of the television reality show Big Brother. So in that show, so it's like, I don't know what the show here is called, but, people live in a house together and there's a camera that, who's the big brother who sees everything they're doing. So he said there was one episode where he saw a man in his early 20s taking a Tanakh into the bathroom with him. So for a religious person like Vortzman, to see a person bring a holy book into a profane place is anathema. So he commented, how could a child go to the toilet and not understand the value and importance and the historical aspect of this book, to be so far from the Tanakh as not to understand any of this? So he began to think about those who don't feel connected to the book and who think finding different possibilities for people to learn in a way that's comfortable for them. So his hope is that since Tanakh is such a great gift and most people don't know Tanakh, that this joint learning can turn everybody into one community where Jews in every place in the world can learn the same chapter every day. So I think it's sort of interesting that the idea came, from a TV show, from someone seeing, people really aren't treating this book the way it should or could be treated, and what can we do about it? So they've created this website with a lot of interesting cultural programming, and it's not, as I say, it's not just the website, but that they had a design of jewelry exhibits. Now they're having tours, now that they're in Kings, when there's different places where different people lived, there are different episodes. They actually have walking tours on Fridays of different places in the country, led by tour guides and discussing things. They also have groups, so if you by yourself want to read these 5 chapters every week, but every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, you want to meet up with other people who are doing it, you can do that as well. And there's actually it's very cute on the website, a little interactive map. You can, press the region of the country, click a button, where you live, and you can find all the groups in your region. So they've really, and I think they have an app now. When I was there, they were developing the app, but I think that they've finished the app. So they've done all kinds of clever things to get people really engaged in Bible study. So and the other thing about the people on the site is that it's from all sectors of Israeli society. I mean, they have politicians, they have songwriters, they have writers, they have poets, they have celebrities, religious, non-religious, although, of course, there was a controversy. They could not get past Genesis 11 without there being a controversy. They couldn't get even 2 full parshas without having an argument, and there was a man, Ari Alon, he lived in America for a number of years, taught at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and went back to Israel because he realized after 10 years in America, really, he wanted to be in Israel and contribute to Israeli society, but he's from the Alon family. His father, Menachem Alon, was a justice on the Supreme Court. His brother, Benny, is a member of Knesset. Another brother, we don't want to talk about, he was involved in a scandal, but in any case, it's an interesting family, all very talented, and he wrote something that was just felt to be too controversial and too heretical, and a group of religious people broke off from the site and formed their own site, and they took his contribution down, so a lot of secular people got very angry because they were censoring the site. So I will not say that this is perfect. I'll have questions at the end. What he said, I'm trying to remember exactly. It was something about the Tower of Babel and Noah and God's role, and God shouldn't have done this. He was sort of criticizing God, but it wasn't something, personally, I didn't think it was heretical. It was something very much based in the text, and very much, we're looking at the text, and this is what's happening. And, if you look at the portion of Noah, God says, I regret what I've done. I mean, that's in the text, Genesis 6:6. I regret what I've done. Nichamti asher asitim. So I didn't think it was heretical, but I think it was because of who he was and the way he wrote it, and because it's Israel. So what can I say? So I will not say that this is perfect, but it's a really interesting place for cultural interaction and for people to really engage with the text in a plurality of ways. So it's certainly not perfect because there is censorship and not all voices were welcomed, but he did start his own site. So there's a secular site, a 929 site, and a religious site. So, because this is Israel. There's something really so among the people who wrote there was someone who was known as the Ofnobank, the motorcycle bank thief. So in the 1970s, this man spent his time ski mask over his head and holding a gun up to different banks and robbing them. And he was called the Ofno Bank because he, on his Ofenheim, on his motorcycle, he would ride it. Do you remember hearing about this? He would stole. And in Leviticus 5, it talks about not just making restitution, but you have to make restitution and pay back 20% more, by a power of 1/5 of what you've stolen. You have to add that to what you're restituting when you steal. So he wrote a piece about making restitution. So he said, isn't this great? Like, I'm a criminal and I'm here on this site with, politicians. We won't say whether they're criminals or not, but, I'm here with, Shimon Peres and all these other people, wow. So I interviewed him. He, was kind of thrilled to be asked. But I think there's something very powerful about getting voices from all segments of society. So I really appreciate what they're trying to do. And I've always found Bible study in Israel very, and I say lively because it really involves all parts of the culture. That there's art and there's music and there's jewelry design and there's tour guides and there's singing. It's not just text study. It's not just the text, but it's how the text goes into the world. And that's really always fascinated me about the ways that the text is studied in Israel. Another place in Israel that I've found a lot of inspiration was a place called the Van Leer Institute, which is so I see some people nodding. It's right in Jerusalem. It's right next to the president's house, near the Jerusalem Theater. And they have a wonderful program. Sorry. There's no place for my water here. That's okay. So every Sunday evening they have a program called Potchim Shavua, opening the week, and they have a different person speak about the Torah portion of the week. And it's not the usual suspects. It could be the week I was there, I heard the parsha was Balak, and I heard an economist speak about what does it mean to be an Am Badad Yeshev, a people who dwells alone. What does that really mean for us in terms of the way we relate to the world, politically, economically, in terms of all kinds of things? It was a fascinating talk. Another place that I, was very much inspired by was a place called Elul. When I was in Israel in 1990-91, I took a class there. It was one of the first years that they started. And the idea behind Elul, which is the name of a Jewish month, is that they want religious and secular people to study together. But part of the rationale was that they want to do something that they call barefoot learning. So barefoot learning is learning that's intentionally shorn of outside mediation. So the student meets the text without outside mediation. So part of this rationale was to enable all students, secular and religious, to approach the text together without some students feeling the others had an advantage. One of the founders of Elul, Gera Tuvia, explains the approach and said people gave themselves the freedom to express their emotional responses to a text. The individual's direct contact with the text became an important element, and this element bolstered the secular Jew's self-confidence. Your encounter with the text is not like learning a foreign language. You can approach the text and begin conversing with it. The text will teach you how to speak with it. You do not need a mediator. You can call this audacity, arrogance. Those who continued really learned, while those who did not continue were perhaps left with an illusion. For religious Jews, this was an enormous, powerful liberation, the ability to rediscover texts that you think you're already familiar with, the ability to react in different ways, the ability not to love, the ability not to receive. And one of the things that I found really striking that year that I was there was that both religious and secular had equal access to the text, that if you're not using outside understanding to mediate the text and they both have access to the Hebrew language, they could both grasp the text. So the religious people might have more familiarity with the Talmud and Midrash, with traditional interpretations, but the secular students were able to read and grasp the text and bring a different set of eyes and insights equally valuable to allow the possibility of a different lens on the text. Everyone was in agreement that we were in this enterprise of textual explication together, and we could learn from each other, which was very different from the hierarchy that was in place at the university that I was studying at also. And it was very refreshing for me to have an antidote, another way to approach things. And I felt like this is something that really could only exist in Israel, where everybody has access to language equally. But as I came back to America, I sort of wondered, was any of this possible? Would there be a way to do this? And in fact, when I was in Israel and I went back to write this article about Elul 20 years after I'd first studied there, the General Assembly of the Jewish Federations of North America thought that they should go do site visits to institutions of Jewish learning around Jerusalem. They thought that Elul was one of the places they should be going because it was a model that maybe North American Jews could learn from. So the person who was running Elul now is named Shlomit Ravitsky Torpaz, and because Israel is such a small world, when I was there, the year I was there first in 1990-91, I was at a fellowship for graduate students in Jewish studies in different fields, and her father, Avi Ravitsky, who is, as far as I know, is still living, ran my fellowship group. So it was just sort of funny that now his daughter, and I sort of had an argument with him. I gave a paper about Bible, and he said, the Bible isn't really a Jewish text. And I said, what? He said, yeah, the Bible's really an ancient Near Eastern text. Judaism starts with rabbinic literature, and I was kind of taken aback. Okay, but I kind of had my disagreements with him. But his daughter is now running this wonderful program, and she grew up religious. And what she said to me is that it's really important to her that religious and secular study together, because she'll say even though she knows more pages of Talmud than another student, she can learn from him or her because there's a value in the different worlds of knowledge brought together by people with backgrounds in different disciplines. In studying sections of Talmud that deal with agriculture, she personally learned from students who'd actually worked in agriculture and worked in biology, and they brought something entirely different to texts on trees, and she really felt that this learning enriched the Torah. So she doesn't think that the Bible is only an ancient Near Eastern text and not a Jewish one. So I was happy to learn that 20 years later. But another thing that Elul does that they're very good at and do very well is to not just integrate religious and secular, but to integrate the arts into their education. So this Shlomit Ravitsky Torpaz said, we like people to see Jewish sources as hashra'ah, as inspiration for their creativity. So Elul has programs for storytellers and musicians, as well as their pluralistic Beit Midrash, and they also have a really cool program called Mikor Rock. So Mikor in Hebrew is a source, and rock is rock. So in Mikor Rock, they take like 15 to 18-year-old high school musicians, and they sit and learn sources, and then they all write their songs, and they work with some really top musicians in the country, and they put their text to music. And the idea behind it is that the kids open the Bible, and once they open it, they actually see how relevant it is to their lives. And she said she was pleased when one young woman told her she plans to continue to open the Bible in her musical life to find ideas and things to write about. And in fact, their final project, they call it a siyum. A siyum is traditionally the celebration of studying a section of Jewish texts, whether it's the Bible or the Talmud, but they had a siyum performance at a rock venue called the Yellow Submarine. And when I watched the YouTube video of it, the person who was speaking said, what's being performed that evening is Jewish, Israeli, and authentic, while being both spiritually and artistically fulfilling. So these experiences for me in Israel made me wonder, is there some way we can do something similar here? So did you give out the sheets? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if you want to give those, and give me one also so that I can. So I have been thinking, obviously, I don't have the budget to start a jewelry design competition. I'm not a musician. I'm not going to, run a school for storytellers, but what is it I can do? And I thought, similar to the way I've seen it done in Israel, wouldn't it be neat if I could bring people from different walks of life and different disciplines together over shared study of the text? Wouldn't that be an interesting way to approach this? So I started off, I was fortunate, I was at Chautauqua. Everybody here is familiar with Chautauqua, right? It's right near here. So I recommend that you go. They're having some terrific speakers this summer. I heard Dr. Ruth speak, and Dr. Ruth spoke it was a week about human sexuality, and she made a lot of references to Jewish tradition, and at the end, it was a Friday, she said, by the way, I'm going to be at Shabbat services tonight, and the attendance quintupled or sextupled from usually 50 to about 300. And I thought, what is it that she's done that's so special that she got all these people to come to the Shabbat service? And I was speaking with a friend who's a political scientist, and he told me a few weeks later, this was in August, and a few weeks later, he told me about something he'd spoken about on Rosh Hashanah, about the binding of Isaac. And I thought, what if I brought people with different kinds of expertise together, and they had something to say about Genesis? So I went through and I had different people say different things. So I have poets. So the first one, I have a poet, Jackie Ashero, who lives in Salt Lake City, Utah, and teaches at the University of Utah. So she wrote about the relationship between her poetry and the Bible. She's a wonderful American Jewish poet. She wrote, so for me, it's extremely hard to say how it is that my being a poet affects my reading of the Bible. It's far more likely that it was my reading of the Bible that turned me into a poet. Indeed, it always seems to me, no matter what I'm trying to say, the Bible has already put it perfectly. So she really feels that as a poet, this is kind of the ways that she relates to the text. I have another poet, the third from the bottom, Alicia Ostriger, who wrote an essay about poems about Sarah and Hagar, the face of the other, and she wrote, to reimagine biblical stories is to discover more profoundly what a sacred text is capable of meaning. We dive into the text, we enter it, we find meaning like a deep sea diver finding pearls. At the same time, the text dives into us, headlamp shining, illuminating the lives we are living. So I think very few of us can write this way, but it's really nice to have a poet, headlamps shining and illuminating the lives we are living. But I think that, really, that both of them, their poetry background affected the way that they related to the Bible. So then I have people in other fields. I have a novelist, Dara Horn. This is the fourth quote from the bottom. So Dara Horn wrote a book called The Guide to the Perplexed, about Cairo and the Geniza and memory. She also wrote a book called The World to Come, about art and Yiddish writing. And she wrote an essay about Jacob and the character development of Jacob. So in Genesis, Jacob is really the person that we see sort of throughout his life developing. He has a lot of tests. I would say Joseph is also very well developed, but Jacob really has a very bless him, and you'd think that he would have something profound to say to the leader of the free world, or what was the free world then? He goes to Pharaoh. What does he say to Pharaoh? He says, my life has been short, my years have been short and bitter. It's such a strange thing to say. Why would my years have been short and bitter? It's such an odd, and it's a sad thing. But even though he has had a sad life, he does have a certain kind of fulfillment and a certain wholeness. There's one point in his life where it says, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem. He came whole to the city of Shechem. So he does have this point where he's whole, even though we know his thigh has been injured, he's been broken, but he does have this sort of one point, and his life kind of falls apart at other points, but he does have a point where he's whole. But he's really a character who has to undergo a lot of tests and difficulties, and he overcomes the test. He learns to be different. He stops deceiving people. Yaakov is someone who's a cove. He's crooked. He's not straight. He has acted with deceit, and he learns not to, and he's called Yisrael. He straightens himself out, right? Yisrael, philological scholars don't like this etymology, but I think it makes a certain amount of sense to say that part of Yisrael is Yashar. It's straight. The first three letters of Yisrael are Yashar. So he kind of goes from being crooked to goes to being straight. He really straightens himself out. So Dara Horn wrote an essay just for this volume about Jacob's character development and repentance. And she wrote, "One of the hardest things about writing novels is character development. The contemporary novelist's greatest challenge, then, is not only the creation of a plausible world, but the more difficult task of creating at least one character who can move through this world in a dynamic way that allows him or her to emerge at the end of the narrative as someone different, or if stubbornly the same, then at least as a person the reader sees differently than he or she was at the beginning." So she argues that because Jacob has this character development, there's something very novelistic in the way that we see his character unfolding. And yes, it's raining. I guess our prayers for rain were answered. So that was a very interesting essay. Another essay that takes an interesting cultural perspective is Sandra Gilman, the second from the bottom, Waiting a Jewish Paradox. Sandra Gilman is a cultural critic at Emory. He's written a lot of interesting things about the Jewish body, the Jewish nose, the ways that Jews are embodied in the world. And he wrote, "Being Jewish is waiting productively by acting self-consciously in the world as if we were Abraham's servants." So Abraham's servants, right, waiting for him at the bottom while Abraham goes up at the binding of Isaac, but waiting productively by acting self-consciously. I think that's a great definition. So if anyone ever asks you, being Jewish, waiting productively, I think that's as good an answer as any that we have. Alan Dershowitz, America's most well-known Jewish attorney, began his essay, which is reprinted from his book on the Genesis of Justice. He wrote, "Would you give your child a book whose heroes cheat, lie, steal, murder, and get away with it? Chances are you have." That book, of course, is Genesis. So we know that people in Genesis do all kinds of things. Abraham encourages his wife Sarah to go into the palace of the Pharaoh in Genesis 13. There's a rabbi in New York, Bert Vitsatsky, who was on the Bill Moyer show about Genesis. Did anyone remember that show in 1996? So he said that Abraham pimps his wife Sarah out. I don't know that I would use that word, but it certainly makes clear the transaction that's happening. And of course, Abraham gets rich from that. So I think it's not at all I don't know, say inappropriate, but inaccurate to say that he pimps his wife out. But certainly they do all kinds of awful things, and Genesis covers it all. And I think part of the value of seeing human beings who God speaks with act so terribly is to teach us that no matter who they are, humans shouldn't be worshipped. So Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, I'm told he's coming to Cleveland in a few weeks. I highly recommend you go hear him speak. He's very learned and a very good speaker. He has a new book called Not in God's Name, Against Religious Violence. And one of the things he writes there is that the Bible, as opposed to other kinds of religious texts of other traditions, the Bible specifically has flawed heroes because humans should never be worshipped. Even King David, the greatest of all kings, the prelude to the Messiah, does all kinds of heinous crimes, and it's not whitewashed. It's very clear. I mean, the rabbis do try to whitewash maybe he didn't, but it's very clear from the pshat, from the plain definition of the text, that David committed a lot of really awful crimes. But the reason why we need to know that is that no humans should be worshipped, that humans are always going to be flawed, and no human is above criticism. Even leaders need to be criticized, and that's an important thing to know going in to vote tomorrow. Okay, so a few other of the things that I wrote about. I have a lawyer who, it would seem like it's very dry, the contracts of Genesis, but it's actually one of the more fascinating essays. He's a professor at NYU Law School, And he tries to figure out why it is, it's always perplexed me also, why it is that when Isaac blesses Jacob and not Esau, he can't give Esau another blessing. Why can't he just take it back and say, okay, here's your blessing? So he says the rule that a contract, this is number 3, the rule that a contract is valid and binding despite grossly unfair terms and extreme inequality of bargaining power seems dubious from today's perspective. The rule of the Jacob-Esau story is simply that duress or inequality of bargaining power is no defense. If the contract is made, here, the oath is sworn and the birthright transferred, that's the end of it. So the point of this story is to make the rule that once there's been an oath, that's it, it's done. He calls it the first blessing rule. Once the first blessing has been given, that's it. So in a world where there are no courts to check out contracts and emphasize them, this is the way it's been done. The contract is valid and binding, even if it's not fair, even if Esau comes in saying, I'm starving, you have to feed me. Doesn't matter whether it's been unfair. That's how it should be done. It's a binding contract. So that was a very interesting essay. Another essay that I really enjoyed getting and reading was by a psychologist who studies facial recognition. He tried to figure out why is it that Joseph's brothers can't recognize him. Because he's right in front of them. After all, why can't they figure out that this is their brother? It's strange. And he says, in fact, this is the 4th one, successful or failed facial identification because it demands a perceiver's contribution often reveals something about the perceiver. Thus, put simply, when faces in the biblical narrative are recognized or not recognized and expressions are correctly or incorrectly interpreted, the reader learns about the skill, personality, and motivations of the one doing the perceiving. So I think that's a very powerful message, that the problem in the story is that the brothers aren't willing to recognize Joseph as their brother. And in fact, at the end of their lives, at the end of their father's life, this is the next one, the 5th one down, they never have a conversation about what happened. There are midrashim that say Joseph wanted to make sure that Jacob was never alone with one of the brothers because he didn't want them to tell Jacob and hurt him, how they hurt him so badly those 20 years when his favorite child was missing. He was looking for his child. How could it be that they would dare hurt him so much? And the truth is that this essay was written by someone who's an anthropologist who studies public health, and he talks about what happens when people die today, what types of things happen, and he writes, Jacob does a lot of talking before he dies, but none of it about the key event affecting the fate of his sons. The sons listen, but never raise the central issue. The silence is an eloquent testimony to the inability of many families to connect at the end of life. So he says, unfortunately, this is very, very true to life. Most families just don't have those conversations. It's too difficult, too painful, too awkward. They're just not willing to discuss the big issues. And he says, unfortunately, the way that this plays out, the silence around the issue of what happened all those years, where was Joseph, who got him there, how did he get there, is never discussed. And of course, after he dies, the brothers tell Joseph, our father said, don't get back at us. They lied. The Torah never says anything about what he said, so we assume if it wasn't written down, it wasn't important for some reason. Either they're lying or it wasn't important enough to write down. But I believe that they're lying, and that's kind of a terrible thing for sons to lie to a father about what the father said when the father is dead and can't say anything about it. But that happens because they never discuss it. And so it really, I think, adds something to the story for us to understand, really, this death unfolds the way most deaths unfold, and people just can't and won't discuss the central ideas. And then, of course, there's Dr. Ruth, and her field of endeavor is something very powerful. she writes about it's not good for man to be alone, so not, girls looking at their cell phones, but people getting together, being alone because they can't get together. And she writes, maybe I didn't hear the words penis and vagina when I was growing up, but come to think of it, I did hear a lot of prayers for shalom bayit. These concepts allow us to teach men and women that peace in the home is inseparable from good sex. So I think I just want to end not there, but on this note that, in Israel, there's a certain liveliness in Bible study, and there's a certain open-ended approach to religious life. So one of the things I did when I was there was go to a Beit Midrash where young people before the army, there are about 36 of these, so if you don't want to go to the army right after high school, but you want to take urine, you don't want to, go to India and smoke whatever it is that they have there, which many Israelis do after the army. If you want to do something to sort of prepare yourself for the army in some kind of leadership way, there are 36 of these mechinot, these preparation programs around the country, and they have various different aspects. Some of them do more social justice, some more text learning, some do both, but when I went to one called Ein Prat, I heard this Shlomit Ravitsky Torpaz from Elul speak, and she spoke to them, and she said, the goal here is really for you all to come out being datlash. So for those of you that don't know what datlash is, datlash means dati l'she'avar. So when you come in, you may be dati, but when you come out, so datlash means you're not practicing, but you have the knowledge of what it means to be religious. You were religious in the past. You had a religious education. So it means when you come out, whether you practice or not, you have the knowledge of what it means to be religious. And that's really what these schools are producing. It doesn't matter what your practice is. It matters that you have the knowledge of what religious texts are, what the background of religious Judaism is. And it's not trying to make you a certain way. And one of the people that I interviewed, I'm going to end here, talked about, so one of the things when I was in Israel the year in 1990-91, before I went to graduate school, people would ask me, are you religious? Are you secular? And I really didn't quite know how to answer. I would say I'm shomeret mitzvot. I keep the mitzvot. I don't feel comfortable saying I'm an Orthodox, but I'm certainly connected to Judaism as a religious expression. So she said that she has a friend whose name is Shlomi Perlmutter, who teaches at Elul. And when people ask him, are you dati, being religious, or chiloni, secular, he'll tell people he is chidati. So in Hebrew, a chida is a riddle. So a chidati is a combination of chiloni and dati. So he's a riddle, right? He's chidati, he's a riddle. And I think that that's a really, sort of valuable contribution that an Israeli approach to Bible study can give us. I think it's very important to be a riddle and to kind of take learning from whatever sources you can find, and also to see that modern fields of study and a modern inflection of text. Alana was nice enough to ask me this morning, is this okay? Is what did you ask? You asked me, how does this...
I was just saying that there's different approaches to the text. There's different approaches to study the text, and one you said is naked.
Right, this naked, right.
Approach the text naked, that there's no apparatus about it,
Right.
there's no history about it,
Right.
and you can just come and see what you want to see in it.
Right.
But the other is the text has been passed down generation after generation, and we've had people who have studied it and thought about it and commented on it. And so I guess I was wondering about the sort of the relationship between those two different approaches.
Right. So I think that the balance is that people have studied and commented on over the past, and but Jews have always been influenced by the world around them. The rabbis in the Talmud say you should learn Greek. Greek is an important philosophical language, and if you really want to understand philosophy, you can't do it without learning Greek. That's an important, powerful tool in your toolbox of kits to understand the world. And I feel like today we have Jews in all kinds of fields of knowledge. We have Jews on our American Supreme Court, of course, the Israeli Supreme Court, but we have Jews on the American Supreme Court. We have Jews who are the highest levels of doctors, scientists, all kinds of fields of knowledge. And I think it's very important that we say, here are people who are at the very tops of their fields, and what can their knowledge help us add into the text? What can it be, to help them and us grow Jewishly and see that this text continues to have meaning to us in the modern world. And that's really the idea behind my book, is to continue to get the text to have meaning in the modern world. So I hope that everybody can make their approach to the text and to religion be one of riddling, not letting people figure you out. And I am happy to answer any questions. If you have questions about how I got some of the contributors or what they wrote, or I'm working on an Exodus volume I'm almost done with, or anything else, I will not tell you who I'm voting for. But I think for my Purim costumes, you know who I'm not voting for. But I'm looking forward to hearing questions. So thank you so much for listening. No. Yeah. No, it's interesting because I think it's both for people who are familiar and want another approach, but it's certainly an introduction as well. And what's also nice about it is it's an introduction to ideas about the biblical text, but it's also an introduction to some of the fields. So, if you don't know anything, like I don't know anything about political science, you can learn a little bit about political science from some of the essays by political scientists. So it's a nice introduction to a lot of things, so to the text and to different fields as well. But no, thank you. That's an excellent question, Hazel. Thank you. Yes?
So you were saying you would like to see something like this brought here, done, and I know nothing about what's going on throughout the country at this level. Is there anyone or any place where people are doing some of this kind of, or are the people at the tutorial teaching stage too locked into their methodology to be open to, so we have to wait for another generation?
Well, it's interesting because I interviewed one of my Bible professors in Israel about this website. So he'd written a few things for them, and he's secular, and he was kind of angry that they'd censored the secular people, although I just saw, I'm on their email list, I get a weekly email from them, so I just saw that he'd given a talk for them, so I guess he made up with them a little bit. But one of the things that he said was Bible scholars are snobs, and, I wouldn't go play basketball and expect people to watch me play basketball because I'm not a professional basketball player, and I don't want to have a basketball player write about the Bible. I don't know that there may be some, but I don't think that, but a celebrity, I don't want a basketball player writing about the Bible. You need certain tools, and I'm not saying that you don't. I think it's terrific, those people that do know ancient Near Eastern languages and know philology and know the history of the Bible and can analyze the layers of the text. That's all important, and I'm not denying that. And I think it's very, it's valuable. It's just not the way that I read things the Bible scholars write, but I think this is another way of approaching it. So Bible scholars do have their own little professional territory, and no, they're not very interested. And as I actually did ask some of my colleagues, I've taught in different places, and I asked some of them, would you write a blurb? And they said no. So the people that I had write blurb, and one person that does, one of the people who wrote a blurb here is a woman named Aviva Zornberg, and she's written a number of books, and I learned a lot from her, and I should say that's some, I didn't talk about all my influences, I just talked about a small piece. But what she does is she'll take literary texts and psychoanalytic texts and traditional midrashic texts, rabbinic texts, and she brings all of these ideas to bear on the text. So she's certainly someone that's bringing in other ideas to the text. And she has a very, very deep Hebrew and Judaic knowledge, which I could never rival. But
what other level could it be done in? Are we only talking about the graduate level and people very knowledgeable, or could it be brought into, say, at the agnostic level with children? Because I know that my children, of course, they're in their 40s now, who are hating anything to do with
text study, yeah. That's, yeah.
Yeah,
I think it would be great if it were. I'm not the person to implement it myself, but yeah, I think it is. I'd go lobby the school. Unfortunately, I'm not so happy with the way my children are being educated here. But I will say Camp Stone. Anyone who's associated with Camp Stone, they do all kinds of cultural and crazy programming there. So I think camp is a place where I think, like Israel, life is organic. Kids are there 24 hours a day, and there's really opportunity for cultural experiences and immersions and interactions where the text isn't just a dry text, but it's something, you have activities. I mean, at Camp Stone, if their theme is medieval days, I don't know how he does this, but he got these horses and riders in full armor to have a joust at the opening day ceremonies one year to show the kids what medieval days were like. I mean, it's amazing what he does there. So, yes.
I wonder if, the Bible as being more of a national property in Israel than
Right.
secular religious
Right.
opens it up to this in a way where, I could imagine trying to get this going and having all sorts of pushback from rabbinic leadership across the board in the United States, where you're really infringing on their territory. You talk about sort of like a Bible scholar feeling you might be infringing on their territory. What about
A rabbi,
a
right.
religious leader who
Right.
feels like, Christian as well, right? That, we don't, the Bible here in this country is a text that belongs to certain groups of people the way that in Israel it just sort of belongs to everybody.
Right. No, that's something I am an advocate of people seeing the text more the way people in Israel seeing it, is that it does belong to everybody, and whatever your religious approach is, you can still have access to the text. You don't have to write the text off as something irrelevant if you don't want to have a religious approach to it. So, yes, I'm sure there might be rabbis of all denominations that would give pushback, but I think to engage people in the text, we need to use different methods. And my husband's a rabbi. I have nothing against rabbis. I love rabbis, I live with a rabbi. But that doesn't mean that I think that's the only way to study the text. So, no, that's an excellent question. I do think that Israel embodies a lot of possibilities that we just don't have here, both because of the language and because it's a national possession and it's taught in the schools. So, yes, Alana.
It sounds to me like there's like two major sort of themes that have kind of come out in your talk, and one is this way of re-engaging the text, of thinking about the text in a modern contemporary setting. What can we learn from it? How can we approach it? How can we keep it alive?
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is when you have a text like that people from all walks of life and religious perspectives are studying together, then the text is acting on those people and in a way helping to create community.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I wonder, and it sounded to me when you started speaking that maybe that was part of the purpose of the 929 thing.
Yeah, so it's interesting, actually. So another thing that my Bible professor criticized them for was he said, well, it seems like it's not so much scholarly as trying to create community. That, as I mentioned, at first I said, the text is in the center, and said, wait a second, no, the text is on the side, and the commentary is in the center, because it's really about the community and the commentary. So the people that are the scholars don't really like the emphasis that it's about creating community and about creating these groups for study and opportunities to come together around designs and exhibitions. And I think that's very valuable, but I do also see his point. I don't think that should be the only purpose of this, that you still have to study the text in a scholarly, serious way. I don't want to take away from that, but I think it's possible to see both. I think he's being a little bit too critical, but no, that's absolutely one of the focuses of this 929, and they've been talking about bringing it here. I don't know whether or if that'll happen, but it'll be interesting to see if it does. But certainly it is both. So yeah. I just wanted to keep it focused. I thought if I have Christian academics, it'll just be like a huge pool, and I'm never going to be able to narrow it down. So I just thought it would be easier if I kept it. Although, actually, I have to say, so one of the writers here, I'm not going to say who, he has a last name that's one of those names. I know Jews with the name, I know non-Jews with the name, and he gave me the essay, and I liked it. And I wrote something in an email about, Jewish writers, and he wrote back, I'm not Jewish, but my wife and my children are Jewish. I said, okay, fine. You can stay. You count. That's why. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not deciding who's Jewish. But I felt like it's a contribution to this enterprise of Jewish understanding. And if he's sort of contributing to Jewish continuity by raising Jewish children, I'm okay with it. But Yeah, of course.
As you're describing the 929 program, it crosses my mind that you're talking about an Israeli national conversation, in a sense, and I think the American national conversation, which is a phrase we've heard before, has a totally different meaning and a totally different focus, and I think those differences are significant and meaningful in terms of even trying to conceptualize how one could be considered.
Yeah, I think right. I think we're trying to do something different and achieve something different. We have different goals and different obstacles than they do in Israel. But yeah, absolutely. And I think a big barrier is language because, look, if you don't know Hebrew, you can't understand the text in the same way as someone who does. I mean, it's really important. So anyone that doesn't know Hebrew, I recommend. I know there's lots of classes here, right? I recommend. Yeah, I recommend learning it. It's worth putting the time in. So. Oh, what? Yes. The disciplines, right. Absolutely. No, it sounds like the fellowship was a great thing.